I'm sure most of you, or quite a few of you, are groaning at the thought of, oh, law, not another form to fill in. And some people we know have been complaining about Big Brother and his questions. But as a historian, I really cannot stress too much the value of the census, and more particularly of filling it in correctly. However tempted you are, please do not become Jedi or anything else. Fill it in correctly. But so when and why did the census start? In the late 18th century, there were concerns about the growth in the population and the resources to feed, house and educate them, as well as the potential need for men capable of serving in the army, with looking at Napoleonic times. This led to the 1800 Population Act, which in turn led to the very first census in 1801, which recorded heads of households and the numbers of persons in those households. It was taken on the 10th of March, 1801, and the details recorded for each place were the number of inhabited houses occupied by how many families, the number of uninhabited houses, housing stock, how many persons in each household, how many male, how many female, how many persons were chiefly employed in agriculture, and then how many in trade, manufacture or handicraft. So getting a snapshot of what skills were available in the country. And at the same time, the clergy were required to submit a return of baptisms and burials for the years 1700 to 1800, distinguishing males from females. Again, another important factor in population growth. Now, this format continued basically in 1811, 21 and 31. And the returns for these censuses, they're a good source for broad population studies. You can get household sizes, ages and occupations, but they are limited for more personal data other than heads of households. And Stratford is very fortunate in that the original enumerators books for 1831 survive in the borough collection. These give heads of households, occupations, and, as I say, numbers of adults and juvenile, male and female. 1841 census was the first to list all occupants of the household on a specific date, with their age, their occupation, and whether they were born in or out of the relevant county. It was just a tick. It doesn't ask for household relationships as such, or places of birth, but you can find people, ages and occupations over and above what was previously available. And here we have a snapshot of High Street in 1841, and it's very clear that at that time most people are still living above the shop. So Charles Medlicott, a draper, has his wife Elizabeth, she's not stated as such, but one hopes she is, and living in the same house are 4 shopmen, his assistants, a male servant and a female servant, but they are living in High Street. 1851 census is the first really useful census for more than statistical purposes. It gave the name of the street, the place, road or number of the house, which we'd had before. Some of the things were before, but there were additions. The name and surname of each person who lived in the house on the night of the 30th of March, their relationship to the head of the family, which we didn't have previously, their condition, whether they were married, widowed or single, their ages recorded in separate columns, their ranks, professions or occupation, where they were born, so more than just tick the county, and whether anyone was deaf, blind or dumb. And nobody escaped the census, not even Buckingham Palace. Everybody had to fill it in. So the Queen will be filling hers in at Windsor. And what I like about this particular entry is that it exemplifies Victorian attitudes. She is the first entry in the return, Her Majesty Alexandra. Her occupation is given as the Queen. Her condition is married. Her relation to the head of the family is wife. It's only when you get to the next row and you have HRH, Francis Albert, etc., that you get the head of the household. So even the Queen is not the head of her household in 1851. I love it. And it's a wonderful snapshot of the town on one night. And yes, you have all the streets, but there are one or two other things where you find people that you are perhaps not where you'd expect them to be. And a classic example of this is down on the canal basin. And of course, it reinforces the fact that Stratford was a thriving commercial town at that point. The canal basins were fully occupied by canal barges with working people. And they're boatmen, and they're coming from all over. We have them from Warwick, from Selly Oak, from Evesham, from Cheltenham. There's somebody further down from Hounslow in Middlesex. So again, people are moving around and they might not be where you expect to find them. And this one too, Chapel Lane, which didn't have that many houses then as now. You have the theatre, which of course nobody is living in, it's uninhabited. And then next to that, you have the infirmary, which the buildings are now the current RSC administration area. And again, people are not where you'd expect to find them. So there is somebody from Godstone in Surrey, Stretton-on-Foss, Bidford-on-Avon, Wellesbourne, Idlicott, Welford, Ulster. So if you're looking for people, you're not perhaps going to find them where the rest of the family are. Between 1861 and 1901, there were minor changes. The broad questions remained, but there was a little bit of tweaking. So there were two more capacity options added in 1871. Whether you were an imbecile or idiot or a lunatic, clearly they were differentiated. In 1881, they no longer are asking you to round your age down, but they ask your age at last birthday. You hope that they become more accurate from that date, but not necessarily. And then under the condition column, they put as to marriage. It never occurred to me, but presumably they were getting some rather strange returns under that column. They weren't just getting married, single and widowed and unmarried in there. But these are all wonderful sources for family historians. 1891 adds the numbers of rooms in the house, again, which we had before. And the occupation now becomes more defined. So you, in addition to your occupation, you state whether you're an employer, a worker, working on your own account, or a home worker. Again, all very, very important. But it's 1911 when we come to the census beginning to take a form more recognizable today. Most importantly is, unlike the previous censuses, which were filled in by enumerators going around from house to house and writing down the details they were given, this was self-filled and signed by the head of the household. So it's a much more personal, in a sense, document, and one would hope less likely to have mistakes. The instructions are much more detailed and complicated. They're not just single line headings as before. Details are now required for the length of a marriage. So how long have you been married, not just whether or not you're married. The number of children that have been born to that marriage and the number still living. So to give you some idea of infant mortality. Your nationality is also asked for. So if you're born abroad, you're asked to give your nationality. Again, you're beginning to see more increased immigration probably from this time on. And the language spoken. This really only applies in Wales at this date. But it's all refining down. And you can see from this screenshot that the form is already getting more complicated. There are endless instructions below each heading. It's very much more modern, I think, in that sense. But you do get a much more detailed snapshot of the country. previous census returns, which were taken by people going around from house to house, had scope for mishearing what is said and for misspelling. So surnames are quite often bear no relationship to what was actually told them, particularly if it was a strong local accent. So that's always something to be careful of. And of course, that can be doubly exacerbated by those returns then being transcribed by somebody else into summary books. All of these returns are transcribed into summary books to give the broad picture. 1911 also had the potential for wrong information, but in this case, it was more probably deliberate misinformation. And it's clear from comments at the time, there was as much distrust of officialdom then as now. People don't like having to fill in government forms, but it's nothing new. But it is a wonderful source for social, economic and family historians. Now, as I've said, the information was then, one of the things I wanted to, the examples that you can gain from these forms being self-filled is literacy, certainly as far as the heads of the households go. So in 18 Bridge Street, we have Edward Fox, the printer, who is signing beautiful handwriting, very confidently filled in. And he's got 6 rooms in his house. Number 6 Birmingham Road, it is signed, by Mark. It is signed the Mark of Mary Ann Teal, and they've only got 3 rooms. And when you look at the original form, you see that it is actually filled in by the registrar, because if she can only sign by Mark, she can't fill in the form. And you also find out that she isn't the head of the household. She has a husband who is presumably incapacitated in some way or not even confident of writing it. So this is that you get a very nice picture from these forms altogether of the literacy. And all the details are written up into summary books, rather like the 1841. So you get the occupations, the occupiers. You don't get the occupations. You don't get as much specific detail and places of birth as everything. So these are good for an overview of a particular place. But if you're looking for somebody specific, then you need to go back to the original return. And this one here is nice because you have 3031 Windsor Street. It just says Common Lodging House, Hawkins. And that's it. That's all you get. But if you go back to the original return, this is the outside of it. And it's P. Hawkins, 30 to 31 Windsor Street. Would not have been large houses, as those of you who've seen photographs of Windsor Street in the past will know. But it turns out to be a lodging house with all these people living in it, in 2 houses, not big houses. Mainly labourers, as you would expect, jobbing gardeners, building labourers, people coming from all over the country. There is Kent, there's Banbury, and so on. And interestingly, and goodness knows why, you have somebody from Rome who was born in Rome. He's only a labourer, he's nothing special, but he is living in, there he is, he's 56 and he's married, and he comes from Rome, and they're lodging in 30 to 31 Windsor Street. So there's all sorts of gems you can find, whatever your interest. There is something to see. The saddest entries in all censuses are those for the workhouse. It's so sad to see how many people are in the workhouse on a particular day. But again, they're coming from all over the area. Stratford Union Workhouse covered quite a large number of parishes in the area, and their birthplaces vary as well. They're not necessarily born in the places they've come from. And this page in particular is sad because it shows the number of people who were tradesmen who had fallen on hard times. So we have a leather courier, a house painter, a tailor, a saddler, and so on. So it's not just your standard ag lab who ends up in the workhouse. There are inevitably, and you will have picked some of these up as we've gone along, caveats about using the census. People often get it wrong, either intentionally or otherwise, so bear that in mind. Places of birth can not always be accurate, because if you have families who are moving around quite a lot, they might not remember where one particular child was born, or you might not remember where you were born when you've left home because you moved around so much. Ages, as I think I mentioned, people were not always sure of their ages, and there can be deliberate lying. And I have to say, sadly, that this is especially true among women, who can sometimes only age 3 to 5 years between censuses. And I know this from my own family researches, despite the fact that there's previous evidence and all the rest of it, their age is always, particularly if their husband is younger than them, they will lie about their age. Street names and numbers can change. So it is always worth double checking with local directories if you're interested in locating a specific building. Don't just go for the current number. It might not be the same one. But broadly speaking, a lot of it is common sense and double checking. The final one, which I love, is occupations are sometimes, and I should say that they're quite often exaggerated, especially in 1911 when the form is self-filled. People will always up themselves. It's a bit like now when you're filling in a form and you have to say whether you're professional, managerial or whatever. You know, you tend to just perhaps kick yourself up a level. People did it then. And so you have to be careful there. But that's part of the charm. They are just wonderful resources. Now, where do you find these censuses? I can show you these pictures. All the original returns are held by the National Archives at Kew, with the exception of 1931, when they were destroyed in bomb damage. There was no 1941 census either, so those two, but they're not going to affect us because they're closed for 100 years. All the earlier censuses have been digitized and they can be found in various places. Local records offices and libraries will almost certainly either have hard copies or computers that will give you free access to them online. If you've got subscriptions to genealogical websites, then you will find them there as well. Ancestry, Find My Past, The Genealogist, they're all there as well. But those you do have to pay for. And finally, I would just like to end by saying, remember, and I mean this, filling in your census form is not just a legal obligation. If you care about the past, it's an historical imperative. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Mairi. That was really interesting. I'm reminded that in Sydney, the bin men in the census used to enter their profession as garbologist. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our second speaker, Sally Bannister, who is a resident of Stratford and, as I understand it, is responsible for delivering the census in the local area this year. So, Sally, over to you.
Okay, good evening. I'm not quite sure about delivering the census, but we'll work through that. So I'm going to present my screen, and we'll start from here. And is that okay for you? Can you all see that?
It's fine.
And it is as it should be from your point of view, yes? Lindsay?
Yes.
Okay. So good evening, everybody. That was a lovely talk, Marie. Really fascinating, actually, even though I'm involved with the census, there are sort of those in-depth things which I'm not quite so familiar with. But my name is, Lindsay's just introduced me as, is Sally Bannister, and I'm the Office for National Statistics Census Engagement Manager for South Warwickshire, which is Stratford-upon-Avon, Warwick, Leamington, and the whole district. And I've been working alongside for the last 6 months, local councils, the Stratford District Council and Warwick District Council and Warwickshire County Council, with the aim to reach out to communities to help them understand the importance of the census and how it affects not only individuals, but communities themselves. And so tonight I'm going to tell you a little bit about the census of 2021, and briefly look at census past and how they've changed. And as Lindsay said, you know, Sunday is March 21st, which is Census Day. And this year it's online first, meaning that when you get your letter with your unique access code, you can go and fill the census in as soon as you get it. There will be 23 million households this year receiving a census form or a code. And so the thought is that as soon as you get your census code, fill it in. Now, what, sorry, this is probably where. Now, what is the census today? The census today is a snapshot of society, which it has always been. And the census is carried out by the National Office for Statistics, or sorry, the Office for National Statistics, which is the largest independent, the UK's largest independent producer of official statistics. And why do we have the census? It's primarily to look at our rapidly changing society, as Marie has really wonderfully explained, how demographics change, how society changes, how we live and how we work. And the other thing to say about the census today, in the 220 years that it has been going since 1801, there has never been a data breach. And this is part of my sort of communication to everybody who are maybe nervous about filling out the census for whatever reason, that there's never been a data breach. And also the fact that personal information, any identifying features, put it in the census, like you'll have to fill in your name and address, all that information is stripped out of the census and locked away for 100 years. And only the data, the numbers, are released the following year, which is going to be next year. And that's what local governments, charities and organisations, etc. look for. But it'll be 100 years before you see your name appear in the census form. Census is past. First known census was taken by the Babylonians over 5,000 years ago. And there they noted not overpopulation, they noted not only population numbers, but descriptions such as honey, butter, livestock, how much they actually had within their communities. But then there are records of censuses, population counts by the ancient Egyptians in the 11th century BC, and the Persians, and then obviously biblical accounts as well of Mary and Joseph having to go to Judea to fill out their census. And this picture here is taken from a church, a Greek Orthodox church in Istanbul. The picture on the right-hand side, my right-hand side of the screen there, is actually of the Incas. Now, the Incas actually had no written language, so they too were taking, in the 15th century, they too took census enumerations, and they did this using llama hair or alpaca hair in cords, and they would knot it, I believe a bit like an abacus, to base 10, and would record their census numbers that way, which I find massively fascinating. The word census is a Roman word, censere, to an estimate. And obviously in Roman times, it played a crucial role to the Roman Empire. It was used to determine taxes. And today, over 200 countries in the world carry out a regular census. So we're not unusual in that way. Our census in the past was the Doomsday Book, and everybody, in your history lesson in primary school, you learn about the Doomsday Book and William the Conqueror. He wanted to know how much England was worth. And again, fascinating that they actually took all these records, and there are records existing, all written in Latin, taken by a troop of enumerators who went around the country visiting, as it says here, 13,000 villages, or a little over 13,000 villages. And I believe, and maybe historians will be able to correct me on this, but Doomsday Book is doomsday as in the day of judgment, that there was no question of you not filling in the census, and you would be judged like you would be on census day, on Day of Judgment. So this was the first inventory of land and property in Britain, and that was recorded in the Doomsday Book. I believe that in 1279, a more detailed picture of rural society was provided by the 100 Rolls, which was another census, but again, nothing took place regularly until, as we just heard, the first official census was in 1801, which again, as Mairi said, was very much to try and find out what the population was in order that the government knew how many people it was under its wing to be able to feed, to be able to know how much, how many crops to grow and whether people were starving or whatever, and how they were going to cope. But also, it is also said that George III on the throne at the time was busy fighting the Napoleonic Wars, and he needed to know how many able-bodied men were in the country that he could send off to the Napoleonic Wars. As we've said before, it was just numbers at this point, numbers of people inhabited and uninhabited houses. Population in England and Wales at that time stood at just under 9 million. And by 1901, population had increased enormously to 32.5 million. And then in 2019, the population was 60 million, and it's probably more, knocking on 65 million now. The population of England and Wales was 60 million, so it's 67 million approximately, or a little over 67 million, and will have increased already by now. Census has been taken every 10 years, as Mairi said, except for 1941 because of the war years. And how it's changed, and this is just image again showing how the records on the one side of the screen shows that the 1801 was just a matter of writing down the numbers of households and how many people, and then it became more sophisticated as time went on with the different columns. Excuse me. Now today's census, where we are today, and anybody filling in their form online will be quite familiar with the image there with the purple strap, which is the census colours behind me now. And also interestingly, again, as Mairi was saying, how some of the questions have moved on with time. And in the 1971 and the 1981 census, there were references as your job, what you were doing. There was an opportunity to put housewife. And now we've got the more gender neutral option of looking after your home or family. And again, in 1951 until 1991, households were also asked if they had an outside toilet. Now we do not expect any houses to have an outside toilet, so that question just does not exist. We don't ask how many rooms in a house, and the example here is how many bedrooms. So we get how many bedrooms there are in the house, so that there's a sort of a kind of description of how large or small the house is. The census this year is very intuitive, and it talks back to you. So you fill in one bit and it says, do you mean you live here? And you go, yes, I live here. You fill in your age. Do you mean you are 3? Oh no, I forgot another 0. I meant 30. And so it goes on, because again, has been explained that in past censuses, there are so many mistakes that you can't always rely on the truth of it. So this year we have added questions. We've always had, or we have for some time, had the question about religion. That is a voluntary question. But this year we've got 2 new voluntary questions. One is sexual orientation, which is a new question, and gender identity. And this has been put in after the campaigning by Stonewall, the lobbying and LGBTQ rights group. And they believe, and rightly so, that a number of people in the LGBTQ group have kept a very low profile, which means that they haven't had access to services which they could have otherwise. They haven't got the recognition in workplaces, etc. So the Stonewall have said that Census 2021 will give us an accurate picture of the size and makeup of the LGBT population in Britain. For far too long, our community has been a hidden population. And it would be great if people feel confident enough to fill in this, because numbers do count. And as part of my job, when I'm talking to communities, if you opt out, you lose out. So another new question, and this is the third. So we've got the gender identity and sexual orientation are 2 new questions. And the third new question is the armed forces. And again, this is a group of veterans which have been, again, vastly undercounted over the years, and so therefore haven't had the support that they might have had the true numbers of individuals been counted. The Royal British Legion has campaigned since 2016 to try and get this on the census, and in 2017 the ONS agreed that it was a question with community importance, and so it's been added. It's believed that there are 21,000 veterans in Warwickshire alone and at least 1.6 million veterans in the UK, but there are no precise figures. And in this case, a veteran is anyone who's served 1 day or more with the UK Armed Forces, which means Territorial Army, reservists, if people have done national service, or are veterans having served in the regular forces. And again, the Royal British Legion has campaigned and is still working tirelessly to try and get people to sign up and to fill in this part of the form and recognise. But again, people have got concerns about this. Those who served in Northern Ireland, for example, have got data concerns because they were told after Northern Ireland, you never wear your uniform out in the streets, you never give away the fact that you've served, because they felt that they might be a target themselves. But again, trying to reinforce the fact that the census and the ONS really pride themselves with their data security. So again, all the veteran lobbying groups, etc., are hoping that this will prove that there are many more sections, many more veterans than have been counted. So that's the census today. And as we have to fill in a section also about our work, I thought I'd just look at jobs past and present. These are jobs which no longer exist on one side of the screen. So lamplighters, in actual fact, I didn't think they existed, and I thought I'd just check before I spoke to you, and they do exist. There are 5 lamplighters employed by English Heritage to light the very few remaining gas lights that they've kept in London. So lamplighters do exist, and yeah, which is quite interesting. Railway porters, again, I thought that was a lovely scene because maybe even, you know, some of us can remember railway porters. Cotton mill workers, I thought was a really interesting employment because of the number of people that used to work in the mills, and the fact that 8 billion yards of cotton cloth produced in this country, I thought was an amazing statistic. By the First World War, that number was diminishing, and by the Second World War, it was just a handful of mills left, and I don't know whether there are any cotton mills as such working anymore. Apparently, we missed a trick in the First World War. Other countries were really buying into cotton mills, as in they were setting up their own cotton mills. And had we perhaps worked a little harder and realised that there was still an opportunity, there would still be cotton mills. Traditional salt miners, there is a remaining salt mine in Cheshire, but leach collectors, I thought was lovely. Well, not lovely, but an interesting job occupation, where the rural poor, women especially, would go and stand in ponds and wait for the leeches to attach themselves. And they would then be paid by the number of leeches to pass these on to doctors and physicians that would use leeches in a medicinal way. Interesting. Yeah. Toshers, a very interesting word. And again, that hasn't been recorded on as a job specifically after 1841. And it's when especially young boys would go down the sewers and try and collect valuables that might have been dropped in the gutters and washed away in the drains. And they would obviously sell the gold or whatever jewels they found and make an income that way. In 1840, it was actually illegal, but still carried on. And there are still countries where this is still a form of employment for some people, which is a very sad state of affairs. Matchstick makers, I think the matchstick girl is something that, you know, we hear in old stories, and but this again was when young girls about 16 would be standing all day to make tops of matchsticks, or put the phosphorus on the tops of matchsticks. And this was an employment that was sort of outlawed at the turn of the century due to the fact that it was a very toxic and poisoning the system of the workers themselves, and get something called phossy jaw, which was where they got a disfigurement of the jaw. So all these jobs no longer exist, which I think is excellent when you actually think about the hardship that they caused. Jobs of today, there they speak for themselves. It's quite dog walkers, baristas, English as a second language, again, which denotes the kind of migration to this country, which again, Mairi talked about earlier, cybersecurity professional, and of course, YouTubers, all very interesting to show society of today. And then just looking at jobs, we're now moving on now to rounding out this talk, and I'd like to show you these statistics which were provided to me by Professor Sarah Richardson, who is a professor who specialises in analysis of past censuses, and she's at Warwick University, and she sent these to me today actually, and I thought again they were really interesting, just looking at Stratford past and Stratford present, about the population. The population actually did slightly drop between the wars, but has picked up and is now moving forward again. And it will be interesting with the census returns, which we see next year in 2022, what today's population is. The number of 65-year-olds, again, aging population throughout the country, actually quite a lot in the Midlands as well, where we are living. Over 22% of over 65s now, compared with over 6% in 1861. But again, lifespans, longevity just wasn't as long as it is now. The workforce, changing workforce now, no longer involved in agriculture as it used to be in the 1800s, less than 3% in 2011, the last census. And then infant mortality, as Mairi was saying, showing living conditions of people. The infant mortality of 130 deaths per 100 births, actually there is no longer that statistic worldwide. So it really shows how desperate conditions were and how the health support wasn't as it is now. And then infant mortality around the turn of this century was at 3.65 deaths per 100,000. And the number of people, a fifth of households living with, let's say, 6 people in the 2 up and 2 down, as again Mairi has pointed out, the kind of cramped conditions that people did live in, and very small percentage had high number of people living in the house. Then of course the protests. It was mentioned about the Jedi. People have in the 2011 statistic, maybe it was a 2001, a number of people put as their religion Jedi. I think in the 2011 that wasn't so many. But protests, again, Sarah Richardson sent this over, which is a couple of suffragettes in the 1911 census put their mark literally on their census and wrote, this is Florence Ada Rightwick of Leamington, who actually not only signed herself as in her name, but then put in brackets that she was a non-militant suffragist at present. And then she wrote on the borders, votes for women, but apparently the enumerator wrote no votes for women. And this Ada would not have seen, but it shows how really quite passionate. And then again, somebody described, this is Phyllis Dowson in Lapworth, described her work as women's suffrage and a philanthropic worker. So it will be interesting for those in 100 years when examining the 2021 census to see how some people have had their say in one way or another. And with that, I can just thank you and ask if there are any questions.